trusting the government.
Abah, you're not a good environment minister.
They're not having any of it.
Hello everybody, welcome back to a very special episode of Beyond the Headlines. Now this is the go-to space for the top stories that made the headlines and more. My name is Amalina Kamal.
And I'm Hazwin Hassan. As the world grapples with pollution, climate change and biodiversity loss, nations are being called upon to chart new paths towards sustainability. Malaysia is no exception. From introducing climate change legislation to coming up with the National Energy Transition Roadmap aiming for a 70% renewable energy use by 2050, it seems like the country is taking a proactive stance in climate action and sustainable solutions.
And the country has actually set ambitious goals, blending innovative policies with a deep commitment to ecological stewardship. And for this particular episode, this is why we are going to look into the country's approach to climate action, focusing on mitigation and adaptation strategies. We want to understand the complexities of shifting to a more sustainable model. And for this, we have a very special guest joining us. He's at the forefront of Malaysia's environmental initiative. Please welcome Minister Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability and RES, YB Nik Nazmi, Nik Ahmad. Welcome, YB, to Beyond the Headlines.
Thank you, it's good to be here.
YB, let's just go straight into the discussion here. Now, we understand that, the rapid urbanization has transformed cities today with, incorporating a lot of high-rises. We see skyscrapers, we see residential towers, malls. Now, the developments to some extent has compromised natural, drainage systems because, what we see today are concrete. Previously, it was creeks, it was rivers, it was open spaces. Roadsides drain are obstructed by construction debris every now and then. Now, my first question to you, how can we look into building, a more sustainable, basically setting of the city while factoring in, the impact of climate change here?
Yeah, I think the real issue lies with we need a sense of humility. Historically, we had the Industrial Revolution, and we harnessed an enormous level of growth that was never seen before in terms of increasing incomes, urbanization, technologies changing, so fast and all that. And it has, brought a lot of people out of poverty. There's a lot of things that's positive about the Industrial Revolution. But there was also a sense of arrogance that we could do what we wanted with nature, that, man has figured out everything. Let's just do the biggest, the tallest, the longest, and whatever we can, we just do and tame nature according to our wants, our whims. So as a result, as you mentioned, we do face problems today, right? Because when you have a lot of people, of course, on one hand, when you have people, a lot more high density residences or even office spaces and whatnot, is better in the sense that it means that there's less need for land. Sprawling urbanization will be kept to a check. But as you mentioned, it will also trap the heat, right? That's the urban heat island effect, and that's a real thing. Climate change is one, but it's made worse when you have all these tall buildings. It can be as much. A study showed that the urban heat island effect, the difference of temperature in Kampung Baru, which is in the heart of KL and with all the skyscrapers, and the Orang Asli clinic in Gombak, which is just a short distance away, but because it's very green, is as much as 6 degrees Celsius. That's a lot, right? So that's one. And secondly is, we've paved up everything, as you mentioned. That's why, we have this idea of what's called a sponge city. A city should be able to absorb water. Right. That should be the first line of defense, instead of just building more and more drainage or ponds and whatnot, because that has a limitation. So what we see today, the runoff, and that creates flash floods. Added to that is also plastic, right? Because plastic, it takes up to 500 years for it to degrade naturally. So when I went down, last year I was in charge of floods. So when I went down and saw the flood retention ponds in KL, when I went to see the flash floods in Bukit Raja in Klang, you could see that a lot of the debris was actually plastic bottles especially, but other forms of plastic as well, plastic bags, because paper would have just, not to say that it's good to leave paper on the ground, but it's biodegradable, but not plastic, right? So that's another thing. So all this has created a lot of pressure on our cities. So I think we know that, cities, it provides a lot of livelihood to the people, right? But how do we make our cities more sustainable?
Right.
How do we make them low carbon cities? And that's what we aim to do.
Maybe I want to follow up on that. You mentioned because last year you were still managing, overseeing the flood retention, the water ponds basically, and now it's more of so it's not under your purview. Do you think to some extent that with the cases of flash floods that we're seeing today and the events of freak accidents, is something that you felt it was taken away from you? Because if it's under your ministry, then you will have a more comprehensive approach to tackling these issues.
Well, there's a pro and con to everything. I think, yes, NRECC, as my ministry was known then, we also included energy, we also included water supply, wastewater, like sewage, and flood management. And in a sense, having it together allowed us to have a very broad overall view on these things. And, you can break the silos easier in that sense. But on the other hand, it was a lot of work, right? So sometimes things like plastics, for example, things like wildlife, I didn't have time because, things like that the public had a lot of sense about or are more demanding about are things like electricity tariffs or water supply issues or wastewater issues or floods, right? Whereas things like minerals or plastic policy, this is something a bit more abstract and high level. Protecting wildlife, that's something that for a lot of the public, it's something that's a bit distant from them. So I think the way I look at it, I treat it that this allows me to focus more. I do coordinate things obviously with Petra, the other half of NRECC, which is now under the Deputy Prime Minister, Datuk Sri Fadilah. And I think, we take an open approach. PM has emphasized that we cannot work in silos because that's always the challenge of any big organization, not just government, any big organization. So I think it's important that we keep that relationship open. Right. And overall, JPS, TNB, IWK, they've taken the same open approach with regards to this as well.
YB, you mentioned about the trapped heat phenomenon, right, in urban areas and it being significantly warmer than in, say, Gombak, which is not an urban area. So with the southwest monsoon that the Met Malaysia Department has forecast, it actually begins today. The onset of it begins today and will continue through the next couple of months. Now, it's said to be bringing a lot of, there'll be strong winds, thunderstorms, and there'll be also very dry days. In fact, the drier days will be more than the wet days, the rainy days. Will this overwhelm the already overwhelmed, I guess, mitigation systems we have in place? Like you said just now that they're under pressure.
It is. We are seeing it, right? I think we've seen the cases of, like last year, I think the heat wave was very noticeable. This year as well. I don't have the latest figure, but I can remember like last year, I think there were 2 deaths at least attributed to heat waves directly. Right. There might be more, but these are things that are directly attributed.
Unfortunately, those deaths were children.
Yes, yes. And this year, I think it was an adult from the heat wave. But, this falling trees thing that just happened recently. And again, this, and it creates a tension because you have hardcore, literally tree huggers, right? Who think that, nothing should be done to the trees because they do play an enormous role in terms of lowering heat, absorbing carbon, even providing us, basically distressing us as human beings, as habitat for various animals, so on and so forth. But at the same time, obviously, safety is paramount, right? So I think this is the challenge where we will see, because it's getting hotter and then suddenly you have a storm. So the trees which may have done well for over 100 years, some of them, right? But suddenly they are finding that it's challenging to cope. And that's why I think PM has been very firm on this, that we need to take action. But at the same time, he wants, for every tree that is taken down, because where we cannot avoid, then it has to be replaced by 100 more trees.
Right.
But 100 trees to get that sense of carbon sink will take many, many years. But that's the least that we can do. Secondly, I think Dr. Zaliha is also, the Federal Territories Minister, is also forming a task force with regards to this. I've offered, I think, because from us, yes, jurisdiction does not lie with us when it comes to trees outside forests. But obviously, when you have FRIM, the Forest Research Institute of Malaysia, when you have our Jabatan Perhutanan Semenanjung Malaysia, the Forestry Department, they can lend a hand, at least give an input. I think we want to make sure arborists are properly trained. Right? A lot of talk on arborists, but we want to see that they're properly trained and all that. So I think yes, more work needs to be done. We need to be more alert. I think we need to check all the trees, for example, because of course, as much as possible, we do not want to cut trees, right? Because if the older the trees, the better. But it has to be in good condition. We also have a central committee on the hot weather and haze. It has sat once this year, which I chair. I think it sat twice last year. So I'm going to call it again, because in preparation of the heat of this phase of the weather, because we want to be able to deal with the haze better. So what do you call that? We are trying to work things as well around ASEAN with our neighbours to improve cooperation with regards to haze, because we know that's another challenge. So yes, I mean, it will be a big challenge to us. We know that globally, last year was the hottest year on record, and it seems that many predictions say that this year will be hotter than last year. So we have to be prepared, and if it comes together with the thunderstorms, then that creates enormous pressures on the environment, on our infrastructure, and the communities.
Right. Maybe I just want to touch on, because we are looking at training more arborists to kind of maintain our greenery of sorts. But of course, it just doesn't stop there, because the way forward is to not have a reactive approach to things. When a disaster happens, then we talk about having to train more arborists. What's at least the ministry stands in terms of having this long-term urban planning? Maybe not just urban planning. How can we manage our forests better, together with the developments that we can see happening across Malaysia here, to mitigate effects of disaster?
I think one is that I agree. I mean, I think in the sense that maintenance has always been a challenge. We have always nice policies, nice guidelines, but how do we keep up with the maintenance and all that? But to be fair as well to a lot of our policymakers, because it's all this the severity of the heat waves, the severity of the rains, the storms are getting worse because of climate change, right? So I think that is another thing that a lot of engineers, for example, they are having to revise their forecast. Going forward, we are working on a national adaptation plan. I think that's key, because a lot when we talk about putting up solar plants, putting more EVs or public transport and whatnot, those are mitigation measures. You want to reduce our carbon emissions, and that's important. But you also need to adapt, because as we've seen, the world has moved on quite fast. So mitigation alone won't be sufficient, right? We need to adapt, because at the very least, we are looking at between 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees Celsius of an increase compared to pre-industrial time. We have to accept that, So that means that there will be already impacts, and which we are seeing now on the ground. So we have to adapt to that. So giving you an example, it's expected that we will see sea level rise that will basically affect 111 towns and cities in peninsular Malaysia, particularly Penang, Selangor, Johor, Kedah, Melaka and Terengganu. And you've seen that the erosion, beaches that used to be there are no longer there. In Taman Perumahans, you have drains where suddenly seawater seeped in because the seawater is rising. So that's something real that we have to address. So adaptation plan is important. And I think another part that people are starting to realize are things like urban forests. Because, they are not pure forests, they are not virgin forests. They were plantations, a lot of them. Kiara, Bukit Dinding, which is in Setiawangsa, in Kiara, in many places in Klang Valley. But, suddenly, a town grew up around it and all that, but that part was preserved, maybe out of, sometimes it's already been sold, but because it was not developed yet, or it was zoned as a green area, whatever. So people, and because of COVID especially, when people couldn't go far, they couldn't rentas negeri and all that, so they could only go within their neighborhood, and these places became popular. I can testify to Bukit Dinding. Prior to COVID, it had some activities and all that, mountain biking, trekking, hiking, jogging, but it was still quite minimal. And it was very localized. But suddenly after COVID, you could see now that and people come from various parts of not just KL, Selangor, and beyond to come and to use Bukit Dinding. So I think we need to think or rethink our approach. So that's why we are working on if we can gazette Bukit Dinding, where it's now government land, it's being used by Telecom to put up the tower. If we can gazette that part as a permanent forest reserve, but then you need to obviously start to replant or new trees. But unfortunately, another part has been sold off, right? And that's a big thing among the residents. But if we can leverage on this and not just rely on the government alone, but use the communities, even get the corporates to come in and all that, I think that will create an enormous impact, because urban forests, they play the role of that as a carbon sink. They play the role as moderating temperatures. They provide, rather than having to go to Taman Negara or whatever, you can use something that's right in front of your house.
YB, you said that the ministry needs, and the government essentially needs to rethink some of its approaches, right? So do you think with this adaptation roadmap plan that you have, and you want people to be more serious about it, are you going to be taking more punitive measures and punish people who don't comply with, say, all these new policies that you have in the pipeline? Are we going to see that, like something to the effect of like a carbon tax? Would that
I think
happen?
yeah. I mean, we are looking at a few approaches. A lot of the legislation has been updated. So, for example, the Environmental Quality Act, which dates back from 1974, some of the penalties have been increased from, I think, 100,000 ringgit all the way up to 10 million ringgit, the penalties.
Okay.
There are provisions of mandatory imprisonment for certain offences. Similarly, on water pollution and a few other things. So the thing is that we do want, because we believe that it has to be serious enough, and we don't want to just basically touch the ikan bilis, the small fry. It has to go all the way to the bosses, right? Because a lot, like when people go and pollute the rivers, they throw the whatever waste and whatnot. It's on the instruction of the bosses, and it has been where we've seen directors being arrested for that. But more needs to be done, and as much as the law may be so punitive, enforcement needs to be increased. But the other part, when you talk about carbon tax, I think that's why the government has started now. I would love to do it as soon as possible, but of course there are some political realities, economic realities. The other part of it is the fact that we are still subsidizing carbon. We are still subsidizing our petrol. We are still subsidizing our diesel. We are still subsidizing our electricity, right? Which is 80% still is generated from coal or gas. Right. So what we've done last year when I was in charge of electricity, we started, we had 3 cycles where we basically reduced the subsidies for electricities. This made the tariffs, I would say a bit more expensive, or they would say a lot more expensive. But that pushed them to say, why don't we install solar? Because then it can be a cheaper alternative to just taking electricity from the grid. So that is happening. And I think, eventually I do see that there is a value, because you see countries like China, Europe, why are EVs so popular is because petrol is priced at a market rate. But in Malaysia it's so cheap that there's no pressure for us. We still save money, but the difference is too little.
Right. So ideally, if we move away completely from fossil fuel subsidization, then we will probably see a comprehensive, environmental sort of approach to our governance then.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. I want to follow up on this as well. How, with what you have mentioned in terms of, we have all these punitive acts being put in place, but the shortcomings usually is on the local level, right? So how does your ministry aspire to work with local authorities in ensuring that whatever is in the Legislative Act and whatever is being amended is pushed forward?
That needs a lot of engagement. I mean, particularly if you look at things related to, even water, which is outside my purview now, but things like forest, land, those are under the state list, under the constitution. Yep. Every single state controls that. We're not even talking about Borneo and Semenanjung. We're talking about every state in Malaysia. So we've tried, a carrot and stick approach. So what is the carrot? We have started since 2019 the ecological fiscal transfer. So basically the federal government is giving money. It started with a total of 60 million ringgit to the states in 2019. It went up to 70 million ringgit in 2021-2022. When Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar took over, he increased it from 70 to 150 in 2023, and this year he increased it to 200 million ringgit. So there's a lot of increase, like 3 times. But we are also looking at for it to look not just at absolute number, i.e. the quantity, right? Mm-hmm. Because obviously states like Sabah, Sarawak, Kelantan, Pahang will always come up tops.
Right.
Perak. But then we also want to look what they do in terms of quality, in terms of conservation, adding new spaces and whatnot. So we know that. So there are things like, for example, we have the National Forest Act of 1984, where it was amended by the previous government. They increased the penalties as well. But another part which is also quite important is that now the idea is that any degazetting of permanent forest reserves must go through a public inquiry process. 2, the moment it's degazetted, you must immediately, simultaneously replace it with another plot of land. Right? So the idea is that we won't reduce the absolute number. Selangor is the first state to do it, and then the federal came up with this legislation, but we need to do it in the state level for it to be effective because it's a state law. Perlis has done it, but no other state has done it. So, we're looking at whether we can, the EFT payments, which are quite a lot now, can we have some incentives for states that do it, right? Because it's only fair. Or even just stop altogether for states that do not do the amendments, at least in the peninsula, because the act was supposed to get all the peninsular states to do it. So I think we are working on that. And it's obviously, for me, there's a lot of diplomacy involved. I meet the MBs regardless of party. I tell them that it's important. Just a short one, when we met with the MB of Kelantan, with PM recently, they are getting like, I think 2 billion ringgit for flood mitigation. They are asking about 300-400 million ringgit for water supply. And then they need to desil the port because of. Right. So I told them at the same time they are already degazetting the kawasan sensitive alam sekitar. Okay, so I say it doesn't make sense. Say you get, I don't know, say let's put a number, 500 million, 1 billion from cutting down the timber and maybe get some minerals out. Right. But then you come back to the federal government and ask for 5-6 billion ringgit. And there's a long lead time and all that to do flood mitigation, to do water supply projects. Okay. But in the first place, if you did not touch the forest, you may not need those projects in the first place, right? So I think if we need to look at it that way in order to come up with a more sustainable model of development.
You mentioned that you need more engagement, right? Especially with the state governments and local authorities. Now, on degazettement of land, are you actually engaging with the people in the area? I mean, obviously, you've got the state government and the authorities as the main stakeholders, but the people,
the residents.
Are you engaged? Do you think there's enough engagement with the people who actually live there?
I don't think there's enough engagement, but I would say the engagement is increasing. And what I do is that I have an open door policy. I meet NGOs all the time, and it can get very heated. Right, and I know that some government officers are not so comfortable. Right, they say, "YB, this NGO, they are lying," or some of them may not have the facts right. I mean, I give it to the officers, right? But I said we are government servants, we are public servants, so I said we have to engage. Whether they're right or wrong, is secondary. What is important is to listen and address their concerns, right? Because to be fair to the communities, they have been brushed aside for so long. And so many things that when people say that they lie or they are just, you know, exaggerating, it comes back to be true, right? So I think to be fair to the community as well, you know, they need some people who can engage, right? So I try, you know, and I drag everyone to come down with me.
Right.
It's unpleasant, but, you know, since my days as an adun and all that, that has been my approach, right? In Bukit Dinding, we go down to meet the residents. And I mean, I'm frank to them, right? I said some of the land has been sold for many, like 1980s. Early, I was probably 2 years old when the land was sold, right? So for us to get back, and we know land is not cheap, and government needs to build homes, you know, roads and whatnot. It's a balancing act, right? But what can we do? What can we mitigate? Or what other things can we put pressure on the developers? So those are things that we do. So I think communication is key. And I agree that, I mean, more needs to be done to engage with local communities.
The reason I brought that up was because we just had a protest going on in Kampung Bohol. The people in Kampung Bohol protesting against a proposed massive housing project in their area, where they have a very vital retention pond there as one of the flood mitigation systems. Yeah, and they're not having any of it because most of them have said that they've been they've experienced flooding since the last 4 years, every year since 2021. How do you plan to allay their fears, as in your position as Minister of Environment and Sustainability?
Well, one is that this is outside my purview, but I was briefed of this issue, and I think it was brought up to cabinet as well. And from what I understand is that actually this process was to rationalize the whole planning. It's not de-gazettement for development, no. So it's because, you know, sometimes it was gazetted for purpose A, but now, you know, in order to have a more comprehensive thing, you need to re-gazette it for purpose B, whatever. I mean, these are some legalese. So they had to do that. But I understand because we have seen flood ponds, retention ponds before that were sold off, and you know, it was to be turned into development. It was not about for better administration and whatnot. But from what I was told here and what was briefed again recently in cabinet is that it's for that purpose. So that you know we were told that it's not. There's no ulterior motive to that. But yeah, I mean, you know, hats off to the residents. I mean, we need to be on our guard because, you know, sometimes some things can happen very funnily, you know, without anyone at the top noticing. You know, maybe, you know, some mid-level guy can just, I mean, we don't know. I'm not accusing anyone, but I'm saying that without that being guarded, without having that you know, oversight, then that might happen. So it's important that the residents speak out.
Right. But YB, okay, I understand the considerations behind everything, and thank you so much for the clarification. But surely, you know, this process of gazettement and then de-gazettement, it kind of gives the public this sort of like vulnerability in terms of trusting the government. Let's say we want to preserve something, but in the future they might be able to be taken away just because, you know, it's all about profit.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, again, I mean, to be fair to the residents is because of history and track record, right? But on the other hand, I mean, there are things we need to do this, and I think it's always important. I mean, when I called them up last year as well, I was giving the briefings, I said it's important that you engage, right? But on the other hand, you know, there are residents who, whatever we tell them, they will always say the worst, they'll fear the worst. To a certain extent, I understand, right? But you have to, if it's already been explained, and all that, and because we need to go through that process, because I mean, if that's for that purpose, that it has to be done that way, and it was explained, and I know because now that everyone is looking at it, right? So it makes it a bit difficult for funny things to happen. Is it impossible? No, but we just have to get through with it, right? So I mean, we're in the process. I mean, I'm not an activist, an opposition activist anymore. I'm a minister, right? So we have to sometimes we just have to bite the bullet and do certain things, and I can't please everyone. So, but again, better communication, better engagement is always crucial in order to allay the fears, which is, I mean, it's founded. I mean, it's perfectly founded by the public. Yeah.
Because another concern is that most of these residents, they're from the B40s. You know, they're PPR, you know, project housing residents. So I think that's the other sort of obvious, you know, problem here. You know, which I think if I were in the position, I would have a lot of questions about, you know, the government perhaps putting profit over the welfare of the community. Right?
Agree. Yeah. But I think the other end of the spectrum, to be fair, is also NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. So there are certain projects that we need to do for the good of the country or for the good of the community, but no one wants it in their backyard, right? And if you buy an expensive house and say, oh yeah, I paid so much, you do this at the back of my house, then it will bring down the property. I mean, for example, to get more renewable energy, we need to upgrade our grids. And no one likes living near. I'm living near a power line, but people generally do not like. There's a perception that it's bad for your health. The value is less and whatnot. Although a lot of studies have shown that that's not true. But anyway, we need to deal with this, right? Because without, for example, upgrading our grid, we are not going to be able to accelerate our increase in solar panels and all that, because our grid was designed for big, bulky, brown energy, i.e. Coal and gas. So it's slightly different than having small distributed solar panels all over the place, smaller amount of energy, but much more distributed. So that, this is an engineering thing, but they need to change the grid and upgrade the grid. So NIMBYism also must be confronted. So sometimes, they use the argument of environmentalism and all that, but we have to look at it and see the bigger picture and an overall perspective.
Right. But YB, do you think that there still needs to be measures put in place to kind of maintain ecological health whilst, looking at the push for development here?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's key, because I think Malaysia, for so long, we wanted to industrialize. And our model, which, to be fair to our leaders back then, it was the model that was taken by Japan, by China, by Singapore, by Korea, by many countries, was to start with a low wage, low cost, export-driven industrial country. I mean, that's how you design the country. So tariffs were low. Why? So that industries will come and invest in Malaysia, and they can pay low wages to their workers who are not burdened with high tariffs, right? And so on and so forth. But that's not sustainable anymore, right? So we need sustainable development. We need high value jobs. We need high value development, one that has the least impact to our already fragile climate, right? So I think that is the shift that we are about to go, and it's not painless. You see in many countries, I mean, even in the London mayoral elections or in a by-election in London last year, it was made into an issue because I think Sadiq Khan had this ultra low emission zone, right? So they were trying to say, you can't use your car, when it's not true. It's only the most polluting old cars that are affected.
Right.
But those things, the people tried to make it a wedge issue, But you just need to go down and convince. And I mean, like for him, credit to him, although he faced a lot of pressure, even from his own party, he went ahead and he won the election in London. So, so I think. But we need to address that, because that's a real thing, and because that's another thing, right? It's easy for you, it's easy for us when we are in the T20 or M40, but especially T20, to sit out here and say, everything should be green, no one should use plastic, there should be no more new developments and whatnot, because you're sitting here, you're earning so much. But for people, there are a lot of people working in oil and gas. We have a huge oil and gas industry, right? Including plastics. It's related to that. All the warung, go and tell them and use sustainable paper and all that, they'll just go and scream at you. So how do you engage them and tell them that we need to save the planet, we need to have a transition, but it has to be done in a just manner, equitable manner for everyone, because we don't want to leave anyone behind in the process.
Right. YB, let's segue into that, because you did mention about the plastic use, and then by 2025, right? In less than 7 months, we're supposed to have zero single use of plastics.
Yeah, this policy you said earlier would even be extended, like you said, to the roadside stalls. So, can I ask you, how realistic of a target is that, YB? Because we're looking at, in the next 7 months, to wean off plastics completely, when I think a lot of people are still skeptical about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I was what I was saying was based on we have a single-use plastic roadmap and a sustainable plastic roadmap. The two plans that the government pushed through. And I think, to be fair, during YBOBN's time, there was a lot of momentum in the fight against plastic. And I mean, again, to no discredit of her successors, it's partly because of COVID, right? I mean, COVID, the attention totally shifted to something which was more urgent. So when I came in, I mean that was the target. But like you said, I'm now I don't think that we can achieve that. Again, we may. I mean, because now a lot of the approach is still based on is based on states. So if you see Selangor, Penang, they have been very fast, relatively. But even then, when it comes to the warungs, the stalls, it's still a bit challenging. So what we're looking at now, also the fact is that because globally, countries are working at a global plastic treaty. So there was recently, I mean, my officers went to Ottawa in Canada to discuss. So there's still some discussions, probably in Korea next round. But anyway, regardless of that, to me, it's something that we have to address, right? Because it's a major problem. So, you know, there are things that, of course, ideally is that you try not to use any packaging, right? I mean, anything. But if you have to use, you know, reusable bags, bring your tiffin carriers to Pasar Ramadan, whatever. But let's face it. I mean, I do forget. I mean, right? I get scolded by my son. You know, he say, "What? You know, Abah, you're not a good environment minister." But you know, we do forget. You know, we are human. So, and there's only, you know, you can only buy so many bags, right? It gets quite expensive. So, what alternatives? And there are things like we still need to use plastic. I mean, plastic is still very useful for medical purposes and whatnot. Right. But there are other alternatives. There's a local company, I visited them yesterday, that makes it from cornstarch. So it's perfectly biodegradable from a period of 6 months to 1 year. Perfectly biodegradable. You know, these are like plastic bags and all that. But the price is very, very high. So we are working to see how, because partly it's an issue of scale. You know, they are competing against plastic manufacturers who have been so big. But even to be fair, a lot of the plastic manufacturers are looking for a signal from the government. You know, if there's a legal thing or whatever. And the other thing, I know there's a lot of skepticism because people say that plastic recycling doesn't really work. But let's face it, again, now here we have a lot. So we've been working, for example, on reverse vending machines. I have it in my office. We have, you know, it's being used in certain like shopping complexes, in train stations and whatnot. So you can put plastic bottles in and get, you know, touch and go points. You can get this even ASB.
This is similar to what they have in some Scandinavian countries.
Yes, we have it in Malaysia, and it's a Malaysian machine.
So do you think at this point more incentives to get people in it?
So I think we need to have a quote unquote, the problem, you know, in Malaysia again, because a lot of the way we collect our rubbish, a lot of the plastics don't get collected, right? And the problem happens when some of our plastic recyclers go and import outside plastic. That makes it worse. So I think, you know, we need to look at it on a holistic model. Then there's the EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility. That means that for every producer that makes a bottle, they have the responsibility. And I think like someone told me, if you go to Berlin, you know, you buy a water bottle or whatever and you leave it behind, people just collect it quickly because it's money. I mean, and it's convenient. They just go to a machine, like what they're having in certain places in Malaysia or widely in Scandinavian countries, then they just put it and make money. They can even buy ASB.
Right. But YB, how realistically, how attractive are those, you know, machines that we have right now?
It's still costly, and that's why, yes, incentives are crucial. So that's why we are looking at how do we expand on it. But most importantly, I think we want to have, what I realized is that there's a gap here because it sits between my ministry and the local government ministry. Local government looks at waste, but plastic and environment falls under me, right? Of course, if you go further to the industry, then you have MITI, right? So how do we bring everyone together and we have a just transition towards no more single-use plastics, and when you sustainable use of plastics where we have no alternative, right? Or it's perfect. In fact, it's not biodegradable. The plastic I was mentioning, made from cornstarch, is biocompostable, right? It can be put in a compost, and I've used it in my own compost, and it's fine at home, right? So because a lot when they say it's biodegradable, it's not real. All that, but this one is, you know, naturally left behind. It can just biodegrade.
Yeah, I mean, like this whole term of like sometimes all these brands do greenwashing and everything just for you to get to buy, to believe in them.
Basically, a lot of them you have to bring back to a plant in order for it to be composted, which doesn't make sense.
Right.
The issue of scale here, because not enough demand is there. Just how much more expensive is it than your regular plastic bag?
It can be, I think, as far as I was told, can be up to twice
Right.
So it can a small bag, 3 cents for normal plastic. This bag, the biocompostable alternative is 6 to 9 cents. So, but then when you add up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're making like you're selling,
Exactly.
yeah, I
Right.
don't know, tudung or whatever, that will be huge.
Everything
differential.
just adds
Yeah.
up. Yep. Yep.
We have one last question before we wrap up the show.
Before you let me off, yeah.
Yes, because it's not always that we have a cabinet member here
Yeah.
on set. But YB, okay, one standout element, especially in Malaysia's strategy towards environmental sustainability here, is the National Energy Transition Roadmap, which is the NETR, and it aims to at least reach a 70% renewable energy capacity by 2050. Right? It's an ambitious target here, but we have time. But beyond energy, YB, Malaysia is also working on, again, fortifying the climate change legislation here. But how can we ensure these initiatives are able to complement one another? And my question to you is, how can your ministry be more visible in taking a proactive action?
Well, I think one is that we are always involved, when it comes to NETR. NETR was initiated by the Ministry of Economy, because it looks at the overall energy, because oil and gas comes under Prime Minister and Ministry of Economy. So it was, cuts across different ministries. Of course now, we don't handle electricity anymore. But we're still involved because we need that in terms of our net zero goals and whatnot, right? Yeah. So I think that the most important thing is, that's one of the things I found out, right? When I became a minister, you read all the plans and all that, so I said, this sometimes it doesn't add up, right? Because this plan says that, this plan says that, and which is the
how do we prioritize?
Yeah, which is the priority and which is which overrides the other. So I think that's why we have a lot of it's a bit cumbersome, but we have a lot of cabinet committees that sit together. So as a result, we all give our input. So because sometimes like kawasan sensitif alam sekitar, for example, or waste that's under KPKT, so they may not realize what we are doing in terms of plastic, because it will be related to waste. Recycling will be related to the environment, right? So we need a whole of government approach there, and I think that helps, right? And I think for us at the end of the day, the other part, the more important part, is the monitoring, because you can have the nicest, glossiest policies on paper, and then you publish, print, you do an expensive launch, and then it sits there in the website as well as in the cupboard somewhere, and then people forget about it. But the idea is obviously to then go down to have implementation committees, not just to plan the thing, but to have for implementing it, to chase the other ministries, state governments, local governments, and the major corporations. What do they do in terms of that? So I think that is crucial. So for example, for us, we have a climate change advisory panel, and this consists of all the big Gentari is there. Then what do you call that? CIMB, Maybank. So it's a lot of the MRCB, even Speedmart. So a lot of these various players are there, and they give us their input, and we chase them. What can you do in your own thing to implement NETR, our climate change goals, and so on and so forth.
Right. Thank you so much, YB,
Welcome.
Nik Nazmi. To our audience, unfortunately, this is the end of the episode. Of course, if you like this particular episode, don't forget to like, comment, and also subscribe. Also, don't forget to also turn on the notification bell if you haven't already, because you will not only get Beyond the Headlines update, other NSC online reports will also be distributed to you. Now, again, I would like to thank our special guest here on set, YB, Nik Nazmi, Nik Ahmad. Thank you for coming on Beyond the Headlines.
Wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Hazwin, for being my co-host here
Thank you,
today.
Amalia.
And to our audience, I'll see you next week.